I have such a soft spot for quirky, creative, like weird fashion moments, and the Miu Miu coat that Ella Emhoff wore at the inauguration was definitely that. So today we are going to recreate a version of it. I found a fabric that's pretty similar, and I'm also going to play on colors with the lining to warm it up a little bit by using this peach skin in the shade Pumpkin. I don't know if that's really the shade, but that's what we're going to call it. The first step is to draft the pattern. I'm going to do some draping here, so I'm going to hang the muslin over top of the dress form, and as you can see through it, I've drawn out the lines with a blue tape so I could kind of get where my seams were going to be, and then I just traced out over the muslin so that I could get that pattern shape. The next step is where I can kind of perfect that out using this ruler. I can like straighten any lines. I can also add some curves, and this is also where math comes into play if you need to size up a pattern. I don't on this one because I'm making it for a friend that is the same size as the dress form, thankfully, but this is the part of the process where you really make those adjustments. After I've perfected the pattern, the next step is to add the seam allowance, and I like this ruler for doing that because it does give you the grid, and that way I can see where the original line is and also add the seam allowance. I like to do 1/2 inch seam allowance because I think that if you ever have to let a garment out, it gives you so much wiggle room to play with, so I'm just going to add that all the way around the pattern piece. Now I'm going to cut that out of the muslin, and then I can start lining that up to cut that out on my actual fashion fabric. I'm going to do a video specifically on matching plaids because I think that it's something that everyone asks me about all the time. I didn't get the footage for this video, but don't worry, I have one coming up. I'm also going to cut out the lining fabric using this pattern. It is important to note that I'm going to do a bagged lining, which means that the lining is a little shorter, so it pulls the fashion fabric from the outside up, so that way it kind of creates a nice crispy lining. So I'm just going to cut an extra 1/2 inch off the bottom of all of the lining pieces. Before I stitch the jacket together, I want to make sure that my plaids are lining up. So what I do is I look at both sides, and once I've got it held into place with my finger, I go ahead and pin it. And I do it all the way down so that there's no room for error. I don't want it to slip as I'm sewing it. I want this plaid to stay exactly where it's at so that it lines up on the jacket. And after we have done this, then we can begin stitching the actual jacket together. Because I'm doing a set-in sleeve, I can actually stitch the entire jacket together, even the shoulder seams and the side seams, because we are going to be doing a set-in sleeve. After stitching is my favorite part. It's pressing everything flat and beautiful. This is really just where your jacket or your piece in general comes to life. This is also like what makes everything feel so professional. When you look at a jacket that's high-end, everything has been pressed to perfection. There are no seams that are kind of wilting in on each other. Everything is crispy and nice. I'm also going to start working on the set-in sleeve. Basically, everything has just got to be pinned to perfection all the way around the sleeve cap because this is not an easy thing to do. You really have to kind of negotiate the fabric around the arch as you go. You'll see as I make my way around, there's a lot of adjusting and pulling to make sure that everything is lining up correctly. The pins are all obviously holding the fabric in place, but the sewing is really important because this is where little things can get pinched or pleated in there, and you don't want that. You want a really nice clean line. So it's important to take your time, really get the stitch correct because you don't want to have to do any seam ripping. Now it's time to start working on the lining, and this is going to be my front facing, which I've used a fusible interfacing for. It's just going to make it nice and stiff. It's going to help hold up the buttons, and it's going to give the front of the jacket some shape. I'm also going to overlock the edges of the lining because I want it to stay strong. I also want it to be super clean on the inside. I think the trickiest part of any jacket is when you decide to do welt pockets. I'm going to do one for you guys today and demonstrate. This is going to be my one flap that hangs on the outside of the jacket. I've actually already matched up the jacket to this print so that I can make sure that they do match. Once I have the welt flap in the correct shape that I would like for it to be in, I'm going to overlock the top of it so it's nice and clean. Then I can pin it on the outside of the jacket to make sure that it matches up with the plaids. This is also going to be the indicator for me on where I'd like to make my cuts. So I'm just going to pin all along the top of this so that I can see it from the inside of the jacket. I have also added a little bit of the interfacing to the inside of the jacket to make sure that when we make the cuts, everything stays nice and crisp and clean. It holds everything in place, and it's also a good support system for the pocket in general. Now let's block out where the welt pocket and the cutting is going to go. I'm going to go a 1/2 inch below our pin line, as you can see at the top there, and I'm just going to mark that the whole entire length across, which is about 6 inches. Then let's mark our end caps. This is just going to be a nice indicator for where the welt pocket is going to stop, and I'm going to mark this on both sides. I'm going to be doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to go ahead and block out a 1/2 inch above the line and a 1/2 inch below the line. It's going to complete the rectangle, and this is going to be our workspace for the welt pocket. I do also have to make sure that the ends have a seam allowance as well, so let's mark a 1/2 inch at both ends. And now let's mark the diagonals, which will also be the cut lines right here. I'm going to use my ruler. Sorry, I get a little impatient. But yeah, I'm going to mark these, and these are going to be the cut lines. As you can see, it kind of forms a little envelope shape, and we're going to cut that out. This is going to help us with the welt pocket. I have removed the pins from the other side of the fabric, and now it's time to start cutting that out. I'm just going to make a little insertion point right in the center of this line, and now we can cut the whole entire length of this line all the way down. When we get to the end, that stopping point where the little envelope starts, you're just going to make those little slits at those diagonals up towards the corners. As you can see, once we cut the diagonals, it actually makes these into little flaps that we're going to be using and pressing. Now let's take our iron and press the side and the bottom flaps down. This is going to get them out of the way, but it's also going to look really crispy. As you can see, the shape is going to start taking form. You can see where that kind of insertion point of the hand will be for a pocket. We're going to leave the top one untouched because the top flap is going to be sewn with the welt flap that we made earlier in the video. Welt pockets are definitely about precision, so you want to make sure that everything is done to a T. Also, this includes a lot of pinning, so make sure that you use as many pins as possible, especially when sewing in your flaps like this one. As you can see, I also lined those plaids up, which I'm pretty proud of. Yeah, I'm going to pin this all the way across, and then I'm going to stitch that right at that 1/2 inch mark on the sewing machine. A lot of you always ask, how do you keep your lines so straight? And it's by following those guides on the plate of your sewing machine, that little silver circle in the center. That's going to be so helpful for you. You just have to pay attention to them and also just be always aware of them. Before we press this flat and beautiful, I am going to trim away about 1/4 inch from the inside of this fabric here. That way when we press it up, it's not too bulky. That way when we're sewing it, it's not too bulky. You just want to make sure that everything lays super crispy and flat. Once that's out of the way, we can actually press everything flat and get it all ready to go, so that way we can do our top stitching and then add the lining to the pocket to make it functional. Now let's flip the jacket over, and then we can actually see that the welt pocket has taken shape. The flap is ready to come down. We do have to do our top stitching still, but you get a nice idea of what it's actually going to look like at this point. Now we can top stitch around the outside of the welt pocket, not on the top of where the flap is. This is going to help keep the shape of everything because we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm going very close to the edge here. This is going to leave us enough room to actually sew on the lining to the selvage on the inside of this. Now I'm going to attach the lining to the inside of the welt pocket. If you're a little lost in the welt pockets, don't worry. I know this is only like a partial tutorial. I am going to do a full tutorial here in a week or so, but just for now, follow along so you can kind of get the gist of it. After stitching along the top and the bottom of the seam allowance, I've inserted the pocket lining, and then I'll just want to make sure that I close that up on the sides so that it then becomes a functional pocket. Also, once the step is done, you are going to want to hit it with an iron. I didn't get that footage for some reason, but don't worry, when I do my welt pocket tutorial, I will have a very detailed version of this for you guys to follow along with. Now I can finally start working on the collar, and to me it looks like it's one piece of a cotton that's like lacy over top of a regular collar. I don't have the lace, so I'm going to create kind of like a scallop hem using the scallop stitch on a regular sewing machine. I'm just going to use a really tight stitch length so that way it creates a really nice bond, and that way when I trim around the edges of the scallop, there's not a lot of like loose threads or any fraying. It's really going to kind of help hold that intact. I also added these little decorative squares in the corner of the collar just to kind of hint at the original collar having some kind of design there. I also cut those out to see a little bit of the plaid underneath of the collar as well. I'm going to start working on the under collar that's going to go below the cotton layer, and this is going to be 2 pieces of the plaid that we've used for the outside lining of the jacket. I'm going to stitch about a 1/2 inch all the way around the outside edges, and then I'm going to trim away about a 1/4 inch all the way around the outside. Then I can flip this piece inside out, and I'm just going to use my shears to push the corners, although there is a tool for this. I'm just being lazy and I don't want to go get mine, but the scissors closed should do a good job. And after I've done this, and I can then press around the edges of that to make sure that the collar is like super crispy, looks like a regular collar. I didn't use an interfacing on the inside of this collar because I didn't want it to stand out super hard from the outside of the jacket. It looks to me like the under collar is more of a support for the cotton layer that goes over it that's just decorative. Now we can start stitching in the lining. Because I said this is a bagged lining, what that means is that the lining is a little shorter than the outside of the jacket. So what we're going to do process-wise is start at the bottom of the jacket. We are going to sew all the way along the bottom, and then the next step will be to sew all the way around the top at the collar. That way when we put it on the dress form, you can see that the lining is a little shorter than the outside of the jacket, and what that's going to do is it's going to pull a little bit of the outside of that jacket up onto the lining. It's going to create a really nice clean edge, but it's also going to give us a good guide point. And the way to really do this correctly is to start by doing it at the bottom and then at the collar. That way you can kind of have some counter tension. I also know that this is like a crazy concept to throw at you in the middle of like kind of like a tutorial DIY style video, but if you guys would like to see a more detailed version of how to do this, I'll make a video solely dedicated to it. Okay, now that I have stitched the bottom and the collar of the jacket, we're just going to flip it inside out, and then I'm going to put it on the dress form, and you can kind of see that the lining has been pulled up a little bit underneath, and it's kind of given this clean edge at the bottom of the jacket. Once the jacket's on the dress form, we can then establish what the bottom edge is actually going to be because the inside lining has been pulled up that little bit. I'm just going to pin all of that so that there's no second guessing it. I want to make sure that it stays where it's at. Once we've established the bottom edge of the jacket, there is no going back. Because we've only sewn the bottom and the collar of the jacket together, before we can do the sides of it, I do have to sew the sleeves in. That way the linings create a beautiful edge. They kind of have this like little pulled up bagged effect like the rest of the jacket. So this is the next step in the process. Also, this is kind of a complicated thing to throw at you again. Like I said, I do need to do a video simply on the assembly of a jacket because there's a lot conceptually to kind of get out, but it is nice to have some kind of visual, and I personally find it entertaining to watch for the moment. So I've gone ahead and sewn the rest of the jacket together, so the outside shell of the jacket is finished, and now it's time to just embellish it, which is my favorite part. I found these crystals, they're Swarovski. I've got an orange, and I have this kind of topaz color. They are ready to use for like a hot plate. They're called a hot fix, but I am going to use an E6000 glue because I don't have a hot plate, and it should do the trick just fine. E6000 is like super dangerous, so it's like probably not good to be touching it, so I washed my hands super frequently. But I just put a little bit on the back and then started to kind of create this pattern on the outside shell of the jacket. I wanted to get some larger crystals like Ella Emhoff's jacket had, but I couldn't because my crystal store was closed, and I decided to do this jacket on a very last minute whim. So as a secondary thought, I grabbed these orange glass bugle beads. They're really beautiful, but you have to use a really small needle. It's called a beading needle to use it. It also has the smallest eye on the planet to try to thread some thread through. But once they're on there, they create such a beautiful shimmer effect. They really reflect the light beautifully. They bounce it right back at you, and I think that it really kind of helped complete this look in a very gunner fashion. And the last step was to add a vintage button. I used one of my grandmother's from her vintage kit, which I think is super special. Also, I added some snaps to the inside of the jacket, just like Ella Emhoff's. You can't really see them from the outside, and that way the button at the top is really a focal point. All in all, I really had a good time making this jacket. I'm actually really excited about the way it came out. I don't think it's an exact replica, but I think it's very close, and it has some like gunner flair to it. I'm obviously a self-taught designer, so anytime I try to replicate something, I always learn something in the process. This time the white collar was a major learning curve for me, so I hope you guys like watching this come together. I'm going to start doing a lot more of these videos. I really like educating you guys and showing you my process, and I promise you I'm going to get those educational videos out to you as soon as possible.